are you to interrupt my royal feast with such pathetic begging?" The words thundered through Westminster Palace's great hall like a death sentence, each syllable dripping with contempt. King Edward III of Albion rose from his throne, his golden goblet raised high like a weapon forged from pure arrogance. The crystal chandeliers overhead blazed with the light of 100 candles, casting dancing shadows across marble walls where the blood-red banners of England hung like monuments to power itself. Have you ever walked into a room where you knew you didn't belong, where every eye turned toward you, not with curiosity, but with disdain? The hall stretched before Catherine Grey like a cathedral of cruelty, and what a cathedral it was. Beneath vaulted ceilings soaring 40 feet high, painted with scenes of English conquest and divine right, England's nobility celebrated their king's coronation anniversary in a display of wealth so excessive it bordered on obscene. Lords draped in silk, imported from Venice, and ermine pelts that cost more than a working man's lifetime wages. Ladies adorned with sapphires from Ceylon, rubies from Burma, diamonds from the mines of India, jewels that cost more than entire villages, more than the lives of everyone who had ever lived in those villages combined. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, polished to such perfection that you could see reflections dancing in them, reflections of crystal chandeliers, of golden candelabras, of the faces of people who had never known hunger, never known want, never spent a single moment wondering where their next meal would come from. Long tables stretched the length of the hall, draped in crimson velvet and laden with food. Roasted peacocks displayed with their feathers still attached, whole boars with apples in their mouths, swan prepared with such artistry it looked alive, towers of pastries and fruits from across the known world. The air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth, thick with the scent of roasted boar and cinnamon-spiced wine, heavy with the cloying perfume of power unchallenged. Incense burned in golden censers, filling the space with smoke that caught the candlelight and created an atmosphere that felt more like a dream than reality. Or perhaps a nightmare, depending on which side of those polished floors you stood. Musicians played in a corner, a full ensemble with lutes and viols and flutes, their melodies barely audible over the din of aristocratic conversation and laughter. Servants in pristine livery moved between the tables like ghosts, so practiced at invisibility that the nobles barely registered their existence. They were furniture, background, less than human in the eyes of those they served, and there, at the center of it all, elevated on a dais that put him physically above everyone else in the room, sat King Edward III. His royal purple velvet robes, embroidered with gold lions that seemed to prowl across the fabric, caught the candlelight and transformed him into something more than human. A living embodiment of aristocratic supremacy, of divine right, of power so absolute it recognized no limits, no accountability, no consequence. Steel blue eyes swept across the court, with the casual disdain of one born to rule empires. Eyes that had watched men hang, cities burn, enemies crushed beneath the weight of English military might. Eyes that saw people not as souls, but as pieces on a chessboard, valuable only in terms of what they could provide or represent. To Edward, the suffering of common people was nothing more than background noise to the symphony of his own magnificence, distant, irrelevant, easily ignored. "Who are you," he repeated, his voice rising to fill every corner of the hall, "to interrupt my royal feast with such pathetic begging?" At the foot of the high table, trembling beneath dark rags that barely covered her skeletal frame, stood Catherine Grey. Look at her, truly look at her, the way the nobles refused to. Her face, smeared with ash and dirt accumulated from sleeping in doorways and alleys, bore the marks of 20 years lived on London's merciless streets. Not just years, lifetimes compressed into 2 decades of survival that aged a soul faster than any calendar could measure. Her cheeks, hollow from chronic hunger, made her eyes appear larger than they should be. too large for her thin face. Those eyes, steel grey like storm clouds over the Thames, held something the nobles would never understand, the kind of strength that only comes from surviving what should have killed you. Her hands told their own story. Rough and scarred from begging and surviving, from digging through refuse for food, from sleeping on cobblestones in winter, from all the small indignities and large cruelties that comprised daily existence for London's forgotten. Fingernails broken and dirty, knuckles swollen from cold and malnutrition, palms calloused in ways that spoke of hard labor and harder choices. Her dress, if you could even call it that, had once been brown wool, perhaps part of a serving girl's uniform decades ago. Now it was little more than rags, stitched together with thread she'd begged from seamstresses, patched and repatched until more patches than original fabric remained. It hung on her frame like a burial shroud, emphasizing rather than hiding her skeletal thinness. Her feet were bare. Have you ever noticed how people instinctively look at someone's shoes to judge their status? Catherine had no shoes. Her feet, blackened with the filth of London's streets, stood on marble so cold she could feel it radiating through her bones. The contrast was almost obscene, her dirty bare feet on floors polished to mirror perfection, floors that cost more than everything she would earn in a lifetime of begging. But despite everything, despite the rags, despite the dirt, despite looking like death itself might be a mercy, Catherine clutched something against her chest with fierce protectiveness. A tarnished silver locket hanging from a chain that had long ago lost its shine. Her fingers wrapped around it constantly, obsessively, like a drowning person clutching at driftwood. It was her only possession in this world of unimaginable wealth, her only connection to a past that seemed more like a dream now, more like a story she'd told herself so many times she wasn't sure what was memory and what was desperate fantasy. Yet when she raised her eyes to meet the king's, something flickered there. Something that made the nobles' laughter catch in their throats for just a moment, a strength that poverty hadn't managed to erase, a fire that hunger hadn't extinguished, a dignity that 20 years of degradation and suffering had somehow failed to break. It was the kind of look that said, "I have survived worse than your mockery. I have endured worse than your disdain. You can take everything from me, but you cannot take this. You cannot take who I am. May I dine with you, father?" The words fell into the hall like stones dropped into still water. Soft, impossible, insane. The silence lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the explosion came. Laughter erupted like thunder, echoing off the marble walls, bouncing between the crystal chandeliers, filling the space until it seemed the very stones of Westminster might crack from the force of collective mockery. Duchess Eleanor slapped her jewelled fan against her palm so hard the crack echoed like a whip. "This creature wants to eat at the king's table." She shrieked, her voice shrill with delighted cruelty. "Feed her the dog's scraps," bellowed Lord Reginald from his seat, raising his wineglass in mock toast. "Even they eat better than she deserves." More laughter, more jeers. Catherine stood frozen in that storm of ridicule, her slight frame seeming to shrink with each wave of mockery that crashed over her. Her fingers tightened on the locket until her knuckles turned white. Have you ever felt the weight of 100 eyes judging you, dismissing you, deciding your worth in an instant? King Edward leaned forward, his cruel smile widening into something wolfish. He was enjoying this. Every moment of her humiliation was wine to him, sweeter than anything in his golden goblet. The candlelight caught his teeth as he grinned, making him look less like a king and more like a predator playing with wounded prey. "Very well, Beggar," he said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried to every ear in the hall. "If you can prove you belong in this court," he paused, letting the impossibility of it sink in. "If you can identify a single piece of silverware from this table and use it as a lady of nobility, I shall allow you to dine beside me." The nobles gasped with anticipation. This was entertainment beyond their wildest dreams. "But when you fail," Edward continued, his eyes glittering with malicious pleasure, "you will be thrown out through the servants' entrance, like the filth you are. Dragged through the kitchens, so every servant can see what becomes of those who dare to dream above their station." The hall exploded in sadistic applause. Hands clapped in rhythm, a drumbeat of anticipated humiliation. Someone started a chant, "Try, try, try." Others picked it up until the word filled the space like a war cry. Catherine closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, the great hall disappeared. The laughter faded to nothing. The smell of roasted meat and spiced wine vanished like smoke caught by wind. And suddenly she wasn't standing on cold marble anymore. She was 7 years old again, and it was winter and they were hungry, so hungry, but her mother was teaching her anyway. The small chamber was barely more than a closet, tucked into the attic of a boarding house that smelled perpetually of mildew and desperation. But to young Catherine, it was home, the only home she'd ever known. Afternoon light filtered through a single leaded window, cracked in one corner, stuffed with rags to keep out the worst of the winter cold, casting geometric patterns on the simple wooden table her mother had begged from a carpenter in exchange for mending his shirts. Lady Margaret Grey sat at that table with a posture that 20 years of exile hadn't managed to break. Even in a plain dress so worn, you could see through the elbows. Even with her once beautiful hair now streaked with premature grey and pulled back in a simple bun, even with hunger hollowing her cheeks and cold making her fingers tremble, even then she sat like a queen, back straight, chin lifted, hands folded gracefully before her. "Again, my daughter," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying the ghost of aristocratic refinement that exile couldn't erase. "Show me which fork." On the table before them lay a collection of mismatched utensils Margaret had gathered over years. A silver fork found in a gutter and polished until it gleamed, a pewter spoon purchased with money saved from weeks of needlework, a brass knife begged from a blacksmith who'd taken pity on them. They didn't match. They were nothing like the grand place settings at Westminster Palace, but Margaret had arranged them with such care, such precision, such desperate hope that her daughter would one day need this knowledge. Young Catherine, her face still round with childhood, her dress patched but clean, her stomach growling with hunger they'd been ignoring for 2 days, reached across the makeshift table setting. Her small fingers, chapped from cold, hovered over 3 forks laid out on worn cloth that had once been part of Margaret's wedding gown. "This one," she whispered, touching the outermost utensil with such reverence it might have been a holy relic. "For fish." "And why?" Margaret prompted gently, the teacher in her refusing to accept simple memorization when understanding was possible. "Because fish has delicate flesh that requires a knife with a special edge, and this fork's tines are slightly flatter to work with that." Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears, not of sadness but of fierce pride. "Good, my clever girl. And this?" "Salad." Catherine moved to the next fork, her voice growing more confident. "Then dinner. The salad fork is smaller because salad courses are lighter, and you always work from the outside in, because that's the order courses are served." "Excellent. Now the goblets." Catherine's tiny hand gestured to 3 mismatched cups, 1 cracked teacup, 1 clay mug, 1 battered pewter tankard Margaret had positioned to represent crystal stemware they couldn't afford to own. "Water," Catherine said, pointing to each in turn. "Wine, brandy." The water goblet is placed directly above the knives because you drink water throughout the meal. "Wineglass to the right because you drink wine with the food. Brandy snifter furthest right, because digestives come after dessert." She recited it all without hesitation, without error, her 7-year-old voice filled with confidence that seemed impossible for someone who'd never seen a formal dinner in her life, who'd never tasted brandy or wine, who often went to bed hungry because there wasn't enough bread for both her and her mother. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hands. Her fingers, once soft and pampered, now rough from washing clothes and scrubbing floors, enclosed Catherine's small, cold hands with infinite gentleness. Her eyes, the same steel grey as Catherine's, shimmered with tears that finally spilled over, tracking down her gaunt cheeks. "Remember, my daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion so powerful it made the tiny room feel charged with electricity. "Remember this with every fibre of your being. The blood in your veins cannot be erased by poverty. The blood in your veins cannot be washed away by hunger or suffering or injustice. What you are learning is not just etiquette. It is not just pretty manners for show." She squeezed Catherine's hands tighter, as if she could press the truth directly into her daughter's bones. "This is your birthright, your identity, who you truly are, beneath these rags and this poverty and this horrible, unjust exile. You are Lady Catherine Grey, daughter of Lady Margaret Grey and King Edward III of England. You are noble, not because of titles or crowns or wealth, but because of what's in your heart, in your blood, in your soul. Do you understand, my darling? Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Young Catherine's eyes widened. She was 7 years old, hungry and cold, in a drafty attic, but she understood. Children always understand more than adults give them credit for. She understood that her mother was teaching her not just how to hold a fork, but how to hold on to herself, how to maintain dignity when the world tried to strip it away, how to remember who you are when everyone around you has decided you're nobody. "But mother," young Catherine asked, her voice small and uncertain, "why must I learn all this if we'll never go back? If father doesn't want us? If the palace is closed to us forever?" Margaret's face transformed. The tears stopped. Her grip on Catherine's hands became fierce, almost painful. When she spoke, her voice carried an intensity that made the child sit up straighter, pay attention with every sense. "Because one day," Margaret interrupted, her voice ringing with absolute certainty, "despite their circumstances, despite their poverty, despite every rational reason to give up hope, one day you will return home. You will walk through those doors they closed against us. You will stand before the people who mocked us, who condemned us, who believed the lies about me and about you." She leaned closer, her face inches from Catherine's, her eyes burning with conviction. "And when that day comes, and it will come, I promise you this, you must be ready. You must know how to walk like royalty, how to speak like royalty, how to handle yourself with such grace and confidence that no one can doubt who you really are, not because of any title they give you, not because of any crown or position or acknowledgement, but because you know, because the truth lives in you, and truth cannot be destroyed by lies no matter how many people believe them." "Promise me, Catherine," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. "Promise me you'll never forget these lessons. Promise me you'll remember who you are. Promise me that if I'm not there when you return, and I may not be, my darling, this life is hard, and I'm not as strong as I once was, promise me you'll walk back into that palace with your head held high." Young Catherine felt tears prickling her own eyes. She didn't fully understand why her mother was talking like this, with such urgency, such finality. She didn't know that Margaret could feel the illness already growing in her lungs, the weakness that comes from years of malnutrition and cold and heartbreak taking their toll. She didn't know that her mother was already preparing her for a world where she would have to face everything alone. But she understood enough. She understood that this mattered more than anything else. That her mother was giving her the only gift she had left to give: identity, dignity, truth. "I promise, Mother," Catherine whispered, her voice steady despite her tears. "I promise I'll never forget. I promise I'll remember who we are. I promise I'll make you proud." Margaret pulled her daughter into an embrace so tight it felt like she was trying to press their very souls together. She held her for a long moment, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, memorizing the feeling of her small body in her arms, storing up this moment against all the losses yet to come. "You already make me proud," Margaret whispered into Catherine's hair. "Every single day. You are the best thing I ever did, the best thing that ever came from my time in that palace. You are worth more than all the crowns and titles and treasures in that entire kingdom. Never forget that. Please, my darling, never forget." The sound of a goblet shattering on marble snapped Catherine back to the present. The great hall, the laughter, the king's cruel smile. But something had shifted in her chest. Something that felt like steel forming in her spine, like fire igniting in her blood, like her mother's hand still holding hers across 20 years and the barrier between life and death. Margaret had died when Catherine was 12, coughing blood into rags in a charity hospital, still clutching that silver locket, still whispering the same lessons about dignity and worth and remembering who you are. She died believing, despite everything, despite all evidence to the contrary, that her daughter would somehow, someday, return home. And now, standing in Westminster Palace in rags and bare feet, about to be humiliated before the entire English court, Catherine realized something. Her mother had been right. She was home, and she was ready. When Catherine opened her eyes again, every person in that hall saw the change. It was subtle, a straightening of her shoulders, a lifting of her chin, a steadiness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. The trembling had stopped. The fear had transformed into something else entirely, dignity. She moved forward without hesitation. Not the shuffle of a beggar, but the measured, graceful steps of someone who had walked through royal halls before. Each footfall echoed in the sudden silence. The noble's laughter had died, replaced by confused murmurs. What was this? Catherine climbed the 3 steps to the high table where King Edward sat. The marble felt cold beneath her bare feet. But she didn't falter. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes locked on the king's, and for the first time in 20 years, Edward felt something he hadn't expected: uncertainty. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments what city and country you're watching from, and leave your like so we can keep sharing stories that touch hearts around the world. The royal table stretched before her, laden with enough food to feed 100 families for a month, for a year if they were careful, if they rationed it properly, if they didn't mind hunger gnawing at their bellies between meals. Golden platters held roasted meats that still steamed, their juices pooling in intricate patterns. Crystal goblets caught the candlelight and threw rainbows across the white tablecloth. Silverware arranged in patterns that spoke of centuries of tradition, of power passed down through generations, of a world where knowing which fork to use could mean the difference between belonging and exclusion, between recognition and invisibility, between life and death. The place settings were works of art in themselves, not just functional objects, but statements of wealth and power and sophistication. Each fork handcrafted by master silversmiths, each knife balanced perfectly for its specific purpose, each spoon polished until it could serve as a mirror. The pattern on the handles, intricate Tudor roses intertwined with lions, had been commissioned specifically for this occasion, made at a cost that could have housed 20 families in comfort for decades. Catherine stood perfectly still for a moment, her eyes scanning the table with an intensity that made several nobles shift uncomfortably in their seats. What was she looking for? What was this beggar girl seeing in arrangements she couldn't possibly understand? But Catherine wasn't looking at silverware the way a beggar looks at wealth, with covetousness or confusion or defeat. She was looking at it the way a musician looks at their instrument before a performance, with recognition, with understanding, with the confidence of someone about to do what they were born to do. The nobles leaned forward in their seats, eager for the entertainment of watching her fail. Lord Pembroke nudged Duke Clarence, whispering behind his hand. Duchess Eleanor produced a silk handkerchief, preparing to hide her laughter behind it in a show of false modesty. Even the servants along the walls had stopped their duties, frozen in anticipation of catastrophe. Young Lord Thomas Sterling, barely 20 and drunk on his third goblet of wine, called out, "Go on then, point to something. Any fork will do. You're all the same, all you beggars. One piece of silver looks like another when you're stealing it." Scattered laughter. A few nobles shushed him, not because his comment was cruel, but because they wanted to hear her fail without distraction. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for someone dressed in rags, with movements so fluid and precise they might have been choreographed by angels, Catherine extended her right hand. Her arm moved in a perfect arc, her fingers held with positioning so exact it would have made dancing masters weep with joy. Every joint at the proper angle, every muscle engaged with the correct tension. Her hand approached the elaborate place setting before the king, not with the desperate grabbing of poverty, but with the controlled elegance of someone who had done this 1,000 times in practice, 10,000 times in dreams, 1,000,000 times in the muscle memory that poverty couldn't erase. She didn't grab, she didn't fumble, she didn't even touch the pieces at first. Her finger hovered over each item, indicating with such precision that even from across the hall, every person could see exactly which piece she meant. "The fish knife," she said, her voice clear and steady as a bell tolling, touching but not grasping a slim silver blade with an ornate handle carved in the shape of a dolphin. Used exclusively for fish courses, held in the right hand with the blade angled perpendicular to the plate. The serrated edge is designed specifically to separate delicate flesh from bone without crushing the meat, without tearing the fibers, without compromising the presentation. She paused, letting the words settle. Several nobles exchanged confused glances. That was very specific. Suspiciously specific. "The cutting motion," Catherine continued, her eyes never leaving the knife, "is a gentle soaring action. Never a pressing or hacking motion which would push fish oils into the tablecloth and be considered," she looked up at King Edward, "unforgivably common." A ripple of shock ran through the hall like wind across water. Duchess Eleanor's fan stopped mid-wave, frozen in her grip. That wasn't just correct, that was advanced. That was the kind of detail only taught to nobility who would actually need to know such things, who would be judged by their mastery of such minutiae. Catherine moved to the next piece without waiting for reaction. "The salad fork," she continued, her finger hovering over a slightly smaller fork with flatter, broader tines. Placed to the far left of the dinner fork, used first in the meal progression according to the principle of working from outside to inside. The tines are flatter than those of the dinner fork because salad greens require a broader surface to pierce without tearing. Held in the left hand for European style, right hand for American style, though of course, in a proper English court, only European style is acceptable. More gasps. Lord Reginald set down his wineglass, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion, to something that might have been concern. His wife, Lady Beatrice, leaned toward him and whispered, "How does she know this?" "The dinner fork," Catherine went on, her voice growing stronger with each word, each correct identification building on the last like a fortress constructed of truth. "The largest fork, used for the main course. Note the slight curve in the tines. This is not decorative but functional, designed to capture and hold meat against the knife blade during cutting. The spacing between tines is calculated precisely to balance functionality with elegance." She moved across the setting with surgical precision, never touching the silverware, but identifying each piece with the confidence of a master jeweler, identifying precious stones. Her bare feet on the cold marble, her ragged dress hanging like burial shrouds. But her voice Her posture, her knowledge, these spoke of something else entirely, something that made the noble's smug certainty begin to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "The soup spoon," she said, indicating a round spoon with a deep bowl, always placed to the right of the knives, tilted forward slightly in the setting. The motion when eating soup is crucial. Spoon moves away from the diner, never toward. The soup is sipped from the side of the spoon, never the tip, and one never makes any sound while doing so. "The butter knife," she continued, moving to a small, blunt knife that looked almost like a toy next to the others. Placed across the bread plate, which is positioned to the upper left of the setting, the butter knife remains on the bread plate throughout the meal. To place it on the main dinner plate would be considered... She paused, looking directly at young Lord Sterling, who had mocked her earlier. Embarrassingly gauche. Sterling's face reddened. Several nobles near him snickered. He had, in fact, committed that exact error not 15 minutes earlier. "The dessert spoon and fork," Catherine said, pointing to two pieces placed horizontally above the dinner plate. "Note their orientation, handles pointing toward the diner's dominant hand, making them easily accessible when dessert service begins. The spoon is positioned above the fork because you serve yourself first with the spoon in most traditional dessert courses, then use the fork to eat." She let her hand drop to her side, then moved to the goblets. 3 crystal vessels, each cut in a different pattern, each catching the light differently, each costing more than most people would see in their entire lives. They stood like soldiers at attention, positioned with such exact spacing you could measure them with a ruler. Catherine's voice took on a slightly different quality now, not reciting anymore, but teaching, as if she were the tutor and this entire court of nobles were her pupils. "The water goblet," she said, her finger hovering over the largest vessel, placed directly above the knives, because water is drunk throughout the entire meal. It remains on the table from first course to last, refilled as needed by servants who approach from the right side, never the left, and pour without allowing the pitcher to touch the rim of the glass. She moved her hand slightly to the right. The wine glass, in this case configured for red wine, which I can determine by the slightly larger bowl designed to allow the wine to breathe, to release its tannins, to achieve proper temperature through the warmth of the hand on the bowl. White wine glasses have longer stems to prevent hand warmth from affecting the temperature of the wine itself. Even King Edward was leaning forward now, his cruel smile beginning to slip. How? How did she know this? "Note the positioning," Catherine continued, "slightly to the right and forward of the water goblet. This is not arbitrary. It allows the diner to reach the wine glass without crossing their arm over the water goblet, which would disrupt the visual line of the table setting and potentially cause spills. Every element of proper table arrangement is designed not just for function, but for grace." She moved to the final vessel. The brandy snifter, smallest of the 3, placed furthest right. Used only after the meal for digestive service. The bowl is designed to be cupped in the palm, allowing body heat to warm the brandy and release its aromatic qualities. The narrow opening concentrates those aromas toward the nose. When drinking, one never swirls brandy as one might swirl wine. This is a common error among... She paused, glancing around the room. "Those who have wealth but not breeding." The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed down on the hall like a physical weight, heavy with disbelief and dawning horror. Not a single person moved, not a goblet clinked, not a breath seemed to be drawn. The candlelight seemed dimmer suddenly, as if even the flames themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Catherine finally turned to face King Edward. His face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed beard. The cruel smile had vanished, replaced by an expression caught between shock and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. "Who?" Edward's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Who taught you this?" Catherine's hand moved to the locket around her neck. The tarnished silver caught the candlelight as she lifted it, her fingers trembling now not with fear, but with the weight of 20 years of grief, hunger, and survival. She opened the locket. Inside, preserved by some miracle of craftsmanship, was a miniature portrait. Even from a distance, even in the flickering candlelight, the nobles close enough to see gasped in recognition. A woman with kind eyes and aristocratic features, painted in the style commissioned only for royalty. Lady Margaret Grey, someone whispered. The name rippled through the hall like wildfire. Lady Margaret Grey, the queen consort who had disappeared 20 years ago, banished from the palace by the king himself, pregnant and dishonored, accused of betrayal she never committed. The queen everyone assumed had died in exile. Catherine's voice, when she spoke, carried across the hall with the clarity of a bell tolling. My mother taught me before she starved to death in the streets of London. Every night, even when we had nothing to eat, even when winter frost crept through the cracks in our shelter, she made me practice. She made me remember. Catherine lifted her chin. And in that moment, every person in the hall saw not a beggar, but a princess. The rags couldn't hide it anymore. The dirt couldn't disguise it. The resemblance to the woman in the portrait was undeniable. The same steel-grey eyes, the same proud bearing, the same strength that poverty and hardship hadn't managed to break. Every night, Catherine continued, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She repeated the same words. One day, daughter, you will return home. And when you do, hold your head high. Remember who you are. Remember who we are. She took a step closer to the king. He flinched, actually flinched, pressing back in his throne as if her proximity burned him. My mother died clutching this locket, father. The word fell like a death sentence. She died believing you might one day remember her. That you might one day ask yourself what happened to the woman you once claimed to love. The woman pregnant with your child when you threw her into the streets based on lies whispered by men who wanted her power, her influence, her position. The truth crashed through the hall like thunder. The nobles who had laughed now stared at King Edward with expressions ranging from shock to horror to barely concealed revulsion. Some rose from their seats, murmuring accusations. Others simply stared, their faces pale with the realization of what they were witnessing. Do you understand what was happening? The beggar they had mocked wasn't just educated. She wasn't just skilled in aristocratic etiquette. She was the king's legitimate daughter, the heir everyone believed had died with her mother in exile, the princess stolen by pride, by paranoia, by a king too arrogant to question the lies that served his convenience. Lord Pembroke, an elderly duke who had served the crown for 40 years, stood slowly. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with emotion. Lady Margaret, I remember when she left. We all knew the accusations were false. We all knew the evidence was fabricated. But you... He turned to the king. You refused to listen. You cast her out like refuse. A woman who had shown you nothing but devotion, who carried your child. She was innocent, whispered Duchess Eleanor. Her earlier cruelty transformed into something that looked like shame. We all knew it. We all stayed silent. More nobles stood. The hall that had erupted in mocking laughter minutes before, now filled with murmurs of condemnation, of guilt, of long-buried conscience finally surfacing. King Edward tried to speak. His mouth opened and closed, but words died in his throat. What could he say? What defense existed for 20 years of willful blindness, for condemning his own daughter to poverty and starvation while he feasted in halls of gold, for murdering his wife through neglect and cruelty? Catherine placed the locket on the table between them. It made a small sound against the polished wood, but in that moment it felt as loud as a judge's gavel. I did not come here to reclaim what you stole from me, she said, and her voice carried a dignity that echoed throughout all of England. "I did not come for your throne, your palace, or your fortune. Those things mean nothing to me. They meant nothing to my mother, even as she died in an alley, alone and forgotten by the man who once vowed to protect her." She took a step back, her eyes never leaving the king's face. "I came so you would know that the woman you destroyed lived long enough to raise a daughter who will never be like you, who will never throw away love for convenience, who will never choose pride over truth, who will never mistake power for worth." Catherine turned toward the grand doors at the hall's entrance. This time no laughter followed her, no jeers, no mockery, only the heavy silence of guilt and shame pressing down on every soul present. She descended the steps with the same grace she had climbed them. Each footfall echoed in the silence. As she passed the nobles, several looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others watched with expressions of wonder and sorrow. She was almost to the door when King Edward finally found his voice. "Wait." The word was barely a whisper, but in the silence, everyone heard it. Catherine stopped but didn't turn around. "What? What can I do?" The king's voice broke. For the first time in decades, perhaps for the first time in his life, Edward III sounded like a man instead of a monarch. Broken, lost, desperate. "How can I? Is there anything I can offer you? Anything to make this right?" Catherine stood still for a long moment. When she spoke, she didn't turn to face him. She simply let her words carry back across the hall, clear and final. "You can live with what you've done, Father. Every day, every night. You can look at your wealth and your power and your golden goblets, and you can remember the woman who loved you and the daughter you abandoned to die in the streets. You can sit on your throne and know that you had everything that mattered and you threw it away for nothing. And perhaps," she added, her voice softening slightly, "you can try to be the kind of king my mother believed you could be. The kind of king she described to me as she died, still believing in you even after everything you'd done. Be that king if you can. It's too late for us, but maybe not for them." She gestured toward the servants along the walls, toward the common people outside the palace gates, toward all the invisible souls Edward had never truly seen. Then Catherine Grey walked out of Westminster Palace and into the cold London night. This time, she didn't leave as a beggar. She left as a woman who had done what she came to do, who had spoken her truth in the face of power, who had stood in the throne room of the most powerful man in England and refused to be small. Behind her, King Edward III remained seated, defeated not by swords or conspiracies, but by the truth he had tried to bury. His hands shook as he lifted the locket Catherine had left behind. Inside, Margaret's painted eyes seemed to look at him with an expression he couldn't bear to face. That night, England learned something that would echo through history. That dignity needs no crown, that justice sometimes arrives dressed in rags, that the measure of a person has nothing to do with their wealth or status, and everything to do with the strength they carry in their hearts. If this story has touched your heart, if you've ever felt unseen or dismissed, share this message in the comments below. Tell us your story. You're part of a community that believes in dignity, in justice, in the power of truth over pride. Your voice matters here, just as Catherine's voice mattered in that hall. Like and subscribe so we can continue sharing stories that remind us all of what truly makes us human. In the weeks that followed, stories began to spread throughout London. Of King Edward sitting alone in his throne room long after everyone had gone to sleep, staring at a tarnished locket. Of nobles who had laughed that night now, speaking quietly about reforms, about justice, about the invisible people they had ignored for too long. And Catherine? Some said she disappeared into the countryside, living quietly under a different name. Others claimed she travelled to France, where distant relatives welcomed her with open arms. A few swore they saw her working among the poor in London's worst districts, teaching children to read, feeding the hungry, never asking for recognition or reward. Perhaps all the stories were true, perhaps none were. What mattered was this. Catherine Grey had walked into the most powerful room in England as a beggar and left as a legend. She had faced the man who should have protected her, the system that should have honored her, the crowd that should have seen her worth. And she had won without raising a sword, without seizing power, without becoming the very thing she condemned. She had won with nothing but truth, dignity, and the unbreakable strength her mother had instilled in her during those long, hungry nights when they had nothing but each other. Sometimes, the most powerful revolution happens not with violence, but with a single person refusing to accept injustice. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in taking what you're owed, but in proving that you never needed it in the first place. Sometimes the most royal thing a person can do is walk away from a crown with their dignity intact. This is the story of Catherine Grey, the beggar princess who reminded England and reminds us today that no one can take your worth from you unless you give it away. That the truth cannot be buried forever. That love and dignity will always triumph over pride and cruelty, even if it takes a lifetime for justice to arrive. Remember her the next time someone tries to make you feel small. Remember her when the world tells you that you don't belong. Remember that the blood in your veins, the strength in your heart, and the truth in your soul are worth more than all the gold in any kingdom. What did you feel as you heard this story? Has anyone ever tried to diminish you only for you to prove them wrong? Share your experiences below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Together, we create a community where every voice matters, where every person's dignity is recognized and celebrated. Like, comment, and subscribe, not just to support this channel, but to affirm that stories like Catherine's, stories like yours, deserve to be heard. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for believing that dignity matters, that truth matters, that every human life has inherent worth that no amount of poverty or power can diminish. Until the next story, remember, you are worthy, you are seen, and your voice matters.